Hi, I'm Dino of Majestic Arms. We're here today to introduce you to and show you how to install our newest product, the Speed Strip Kit Master Grade. Now the Master Grade is everything we know how to do for you. I'll pause and let the camera show you a Master Kit's laid out here in front of me. The Master Kit comprises our Speed Strip pin for rapid dismantling, matching hammer, sear, and bushing for a 2.5 pound trigger pull, one of our speed triggers with the over travel adjustment screw, and the newest addition now is a new disconnector bar with one size left oversized for final fitting to give you the shortest possible stroke on the trigger, which equals the quickest possible return and reset on the trigger. And so let's get started. We're going to install one today in our new Ruger 2245 Lite. The first thing we'll do is check to make sure the gun's not loaded. Close the action. This gun still has a magazine disconnector in place, so we'll leave the magazine in. We'll dry fire it. Now we'll remove our magazine and lay it aside. Now what we want to do is pry open this little pocket knife like latch attachment here in the back of the mainspring housing assembly. So what I like to do is come in from the corner with a small screwdriver, pry open the latch just like that. Now your mainspring housing assembly will pivot away from the frame. Now many of these guns you can grab this and pull it right down. This gun's very tight, so what I'm going to use is a nylon punch. A wooden dowel will work just as well. With the mainspring housing assembly open, I'm going to tap down on that pin and get it to move out of the frame. There's our whole mainspring housing assembly. We'll lay that aside for now. Now what we're going to do is remove the bolt from the upper receiver tube. Lay that aside. Now I want to dismount my upper receiver and barrel assembly from the grip frame. Now a lot of people will hold it and hit this with a mallet, and that method works, but I'm not in favor of it. It's very easy to miss and either break or damage your sights. So what I like to do on a padded surface, I'm going to come to the corner of my workbench where there's a leg and it's nice and sturdy. I'm going to take a firm grip of the upper receiver, I'm going to take a firm grip of the pistol grip frame, and with one quick blow I'm going to come down and strike the back of the receiver, which will drive it forward and dismount it from the grip frame. There we go. Upper receiver is off, we can lay it aside. Now we need a 332 Allen key, and we remove both the grip panels from both sides of the frame. Okay, now we're ready to get started dismantling the frame assembly. Now I have a cutaway I'm going to show you, but I'd like to discuss right now. There are 3 pins that we're going to deal with. I'll pause to let the camera catch up to me. We're going to deal with our hammer pivot pin, our sear pivot pin, and our trigger pivot pin. Now each of these pins has a spring that retains it, and there's a trick to getting them all out. You are never to use a hammer and punch and use force to drive these pins out. It's not how it works. You'll damage the springs, you might even hurt the frame. Now on the cutaway, once again I'll pause for the camera to catch up. The sear spring has an extra piece to it. It has a long tail. And what that does is it wraps around the front edge of the sear pivot pin, and the sear pivot pin has a groove that it snaps into, and that retains the sear pivot pin. Then it flexes backward to the back side of the hammer pivot pin, which also has a groove, and that locks in your hammer pivot pin. And what we're going to do is show you the trick to get those out. I'll lay the cutaway aside right now, we're not going to use it. I know the camera probably won't be able to catch this, but behind the hammer pivot pin, that spring stands straight up like I'm holding this punch. When you look down on it, it's kind of like looking down on a sewing needle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small 1/16 of an inch punch, and I'm going to bring it in right between the pivot pin and the spring, and I'm going to flex that spring away from the pin. And now at this point, the pin comes right out with no actual force. Now what we can do is take our whole hammer assembly and disconnector bar, pivot it up, we can take these pieces out. I'll pause for a moment for the camera to catch up. We have a Mark III style bushing, which is a piece of tubing, a dogleg shaped piece of sheet metal with a corresponding spring. These components are what comprise your magazine disconnector. This gun won't have a magazine disconnector when we're done, so we're going to take these parts and we're going to lay them aside. We're not going to use the original hammer, but we do want to retain the strut and the pin, so we're going to remove those from the original hammer, and then we're going to discard the hammer. I'm going to lay the hammer on a bench block. I'm going to use a 332 punch. And I'm going to come in right here. I'm going to drive out that pin. We can put those aside. We're going to reuse them. We're not going to reuse the original hammer, so we're going to discard that. Now I'm going to pull out my hammer pivot pin all the way. When I do so, the safety should fall out. There we go. Lay that part aside. We're going to reuse it. Take out the safety. I'm going to pause again for the camera to catch up. I'd like to mention the shaft of your safety has a small spring and a plunger. And that's what gives it its detent action from the fire to safe position. Let's be mindful not to lose the spring and the plunger. It's real easy to do. I'll lay that aside. Now what I'm going to do, and I apologize, I know the camera won't be able to catch it, is I'm going to put my finger in and I'm going to flex the spring forward a little bit, get it away from the sear pin, and that will nice and easily let the sear pin come out. In the center of our trigger, we have a spring and a plunger. We're going to take those out so as to not lose them and lay them aside right now. And there's the spring and the plunger for the trigger. Turn it upside down. Out comes our original sear and our sear spring. And we're not going to use the original sear either, so I'm going to discard that. Now we want to remove the trigger and the disconnector bar from the frame. I'm going to turn it this way. There is a hole right here. And if you look inside your grip frame, again I apologize if the camera can't catch it, you'll see a piece of wire coming up from the grip frame. And that's actually a spring. It locks into the little hole in the frame, it runs past your magazine latch, and it retains the magazine latch. Then it runs up underneath your trigger pivot pin, which has a corresponding groove, and that locks your trigger pivot pin into the frame. The right way to remove that is as close to the trigger as possible. I'm going to come in with a 332 punch. I'm going to push down and keep that spring compressed. And then I'm going to just push, and right to left, I'm going to slip out my trigger pivot pin. And now my entire original trigger and disconnector bar come out. We're not going to reuse those, so those go to the discard pile. Now we're ready to start installing the master kit. So the first thing I like to do, it has an over travel adjustment screw in your trigger. We supply you with the proper size 1/16 of an inch Allen key. Now these are cup point screws, so that means they've got a little bit of a cup on the other end, but they also usually have burrs. So what I like to do is I'm going to use a smooth diamond needle file, piece of sandpaper on a stick will work just as well, and a couple of passes. I want to just make sure I get rid of those burrs and I have a nice smooth contact surface. And it's a real easy thing to do. That's done. Now you take your disconnector bar, and that drops directly into the trigger. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move that trigger pivot pin out of the way enough to allow the new trigger into the frame. I'm going to bring it in, and I like to look at the right side, like looking through a window, line up the trigger, and then push the pin in. You'll hear an audible click. That spring should snap into place, and that'll retain the pin. Before we go on, I'm going to just point out what's oversized and why this disconnector bar does require a little fitting. This one tab here is what rides up behind the sear and pulls the sear out of the way. We left this one forward dimension oversized, and I'm going to take a little pause so the camera can keep up. I have a cutaway version of it right here so I can show you exactly what we're going to do. These guns have a long, slacky, two-stage trigger pull, and what it is the distance from that tab, I'll hold it this way, hopefully you can get a good view, from the distance from the tab to the sear itself. We're going to shorten that distance with an oversized part, and we're going to fit it up to have the least amount of play possible between those two parts. So now we'll lay this aside, and we'll begin the installations. I'm going to pivot the disconnector bar out of the way. Here's our sear spring. I'll pause, see if the camera can catch up. There's the long tail that we discussed. That's what's going to retain your springs. You've got 3 coils and a short tail that go toward the center of the frame. I know I can't show you this on camera, but at the base of this little cutout there is a pocket. The loop of the sear spring drops right into the pocket. The way to do that is to take the sear spring, orient it with the long tail against the frame, lay it on there, and just slide it down until it drops into the pocket. Now we're going to put our sear pin back into place. The sear pin has a groove on it. The groove faces the left. It'll be the last part of the pin into the frame, and the spring will keep it. So I start my sear pin in, and I'll take a little punch, and I'm going to just pick up that sear spring and get the pin to run through the coils and just get it to stay in place. And now I'm ready to put in the new sear. I'd like to point to the sear. I'll pause for the camera to catch up. The sear has an orientation. It has a radius cut. The radius faces the back of the grip frame. It's the only way the sear goes in. I'm going to take the sear, and I'm going to use a pair of locking forceps. If you don't have them, a long pair of needle nose pliers with some rubber bands on the handle will work just fine. I'm going to take a good grip of the sear. What I must do is come in from the back and can kind of walk it forward against the spring. I will feel spring tension as I'm doing this, and get that sear pin to go through the sear and hold it in place. Okay, great. I've got the sear in. Now we're going to put the hammer pivot pin back into place. As I had discussed earlier, the spring must retain the hammer pivot pin. It rides the forward edge of the sear pin and the back edge of the hammer pin. Once again, I apologize. I know the camera probably won't catch this, but I'm going to flex that spring backward. I'm going to put the pin through the frame, and I'm going to make this spring sit on the back side of the pin. Now what we want to do is reinstall our safety. Again, as we discussed earlier, there's a little spring and a plunger. Let's be mindful not to lose them. We've got to have our sear in an upright position, and this part is admittedly a little bit of a finagle. And make sure the sear is upright. We're going to take our safety. We're going to, oh, just fell down. Let me just correct that. Bring it through the frame. I have to hold it. Now I have to pivot my sear forward a little bit, pivot the safety downward, and get that hammer pin to go through the safety. And now we've got that whole assembly in, and that'll stay put. And I'm going to take a little bit of a pause and let the camera catch up to how that assembly will stay put. We're going to reuse the trigger spring and plunger. It goes in the center of the trigger. It's what powers your disconnector bar. It's what also gives your gun the reset on the trigger. I'm going to put those two parts in. I'm going to just do that for the moment and lay them aside. Now we're ready to install the new hammer. So we're going to take our new hammer. We take the bushing out for a moment. We don't need it just yet. As we said earlier, we're going to reuse the hammer strut and the retaining pin. Now the hammer strut is not symmetrical. It has a radius on its backside and it has a straight edge. The radius faces the back of the frame. The hammer strut retaining pin comes into the left side of the hammer. So when you start that into the hole, the easiest way to do this is to bring the strut into the hammer, look down on it, and when you get them all lined up, tap the hammer down onto the pin. It actually goes easier than trying to do it the other way. The large head should be flush to the hammer. Now the Ruger pins, if you look at them, the very end has a dimple in it. Ruger does things very efficiently. The pin probably drops right into place. I'm going to take a sharpened punch, and I'm just going to give the end a little bit of a dimple, very little, and that'll flare the end of the pin slightly, and it'll make it stick tight into the hammer. On the right side of the hammer goes the new bushing, and now we're ready to put it into the frame, and we're going to start the fitting. So we pivot up our disconnector bar, we bring our hammer in. The easy way to do this is, again, the window principle. Look through the other side of the frame till it lines up, slide it into place. Now when we bring this back, right now our disconnector bar is in an upright position. The gun fires. We simulate firing it, we recock the hammer and push down on the disconnector bar. Here's where the fitting is going to come in. This disconnector bar is oversized, so it is not getting back up behind the sear, and we're going to remove a little bit of material at a time until we get proper disconnection. I'm going to show you a shortcut now, how you can cut and fit this bar without going through the entire process of removing it from the frame. Here comes the shortcut. Pivot that sear spring backward so that it releases the hammer pin. This particular time, I'm not going to pull the hammer pin free from the frame. All I'm going to do is pull it out just far enough to release the hammer. Pivot our disconnector bar forward. That whole assembly will stay together. The spring and plunger in the center of the trigger is easy to lose, so I'm going to drop them out. Now what we're going to do, once again I'll pause, give the camera a chance to catch up. The forward edge of the tab on your disconnector bar, we're going to remove a little bit of material at a time until we get disconnection where it can reset and come up behind the sear to set you up for your next shot. The way I like to do it is I'll put my bench block here, put my frame here. I'm going to use a safe-edged file, which means one side is smooth and does not cut. I'm going to come in right here and keeping it square. I'm going to take several passes and remove a little bit of material. The amount of material being removed for a final fit will run between 8 and 12 thousandths of an inch. It's not a lot, but this little bit of effort will pay off down the road in the feel of our trigger. Now let's do a function check and see where we're at. Put the spring and the plunger back into the center of the trigger. Put my hammer back in. Pivot the hammer back to a cocked position. Put some pressure behind it. The disconnector bar is indeed up. The gun fires. Pivot the hammer back to simulate cocking. Push down on the disconnector bar, and when I release it, the disconnector bar came up, but not reliably. It's a little bit rough. That's great. It means we're in the home stretch. We just need a little bit more fitting and we'll be done with this. So let's go back to the shortcut. Pivot the spring out of the way. Push on my hammer pin right to left. I'm not going to pull it out of the frame. Just going to ease it out enough to release the hammer. Leave my sear and everything set. Take that spring and plunger out of the trigger because they want to get lost. We're not going to let that happen. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to just take a couple of more passes and then I'm going to clean it up with a stone. Now remember the golden rule. We can always remove a little bit more material, but we can't put anything back. So I'm going to take 3 passes now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch a little bit. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch aluminum oxide stone from Brownells. And when we cut with a file, we usually leave some rough edges. Just going to give it a nice, smooth, slick finish. But what I also like to do now is come on the side, smoothen it, but I'm going to now bring my stone on an angle, and I'm just going to give a slight bevel on the edge and make sure I didn't leave any rough burrs that'll cause us some problems. I see a nice bevel. I come here and I break it and just make sure we have a nice smooth edge with no rough edges. Let's put it together and give it a function check, and we'll do another one before we put the upper receiver back on and we'll start to finish up. Put my hammer back in. Cock my hammer, disconnector bar is up, releases, simulate firing, push down on the disconnector bar with the hammer cocked. When I release, it should come back up. Notice how it pops right back up into position now. What we're going to do is one more thing before we reassemble the gun. We're going to put the mainspring housing in and we're going to put some spring tension on that hammer. Now you can assemble this entire thing without the upper receiver for functioning test purposes. There, we've got it. Trigger's got very little motion. The hammer fires, simulate firing, cock it back. When I release the trigger, the disconnector bar gets right back up onto the job. Let's do that again. Okay, we've got that all fitted up. It's functioning nicely. The last thing we want to do is the over travel adjustment screw in the center of the trigger. Now the whole purpose of that screw is to allow the trigger to move just far enough for the sear to release the hammer with no continuous motion. Gives you the nicest feel on the trigger. At this point you can actually look down inside and see the entire relationship to the hammer and the sear. So it's a very simple adjustment. You'll see that the sear moves further than is necessary. So you'll take your 1/16 of an inch Allen key and we'll give this about a 1/2 turn. Just right. Trigger moves just enough to release the hammer with no continuous motion, so we've got our over travel adjustment set. The one thing I didn't mention, that I'm doing a dry run now. Normally I would apply Loctite to this, but bear in mind, once you apply Loctite, the clock is ticking. Don't do it until you're finished with all your fittings, and that's the final, is to take it all apart one more time, put some Loctite on that screw. So now we're going to dismantle this, take out our mainspring housing assembly. We should pretty much be done with the lower frame. I'm going to do 2 things though. I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant in there. I like to use Shooter's Choice FP10. I think it's one of the finest lubricants that's been introduced to the firearms industry. And the key points where I want to put some, I'm going to put a drop on either side of my trigger where it pivots. I'm going to put a drop right where the drawbar comes in and pivots on the trigger. I'm going to put a drop on my plunger, 1 drop on either side of the hammer, and another drop right on top of the disconnector bar. Now at this point we can put our upper receiver back onto our grip frame. What I'd like to mention is the way these guns work is, I'll pause and let the camera catch up to me. We have a big hook lug arrangement in the front. And we have a corresponding cutout in your receiver that press fits the two together. And essentially we're galling two pieces of metal together. So what I like to do, saves wear and tear, makes it easier to put it back on, makes it easier to take off, is I'm going to apply some grease to the bottom end of the lug. And the one that I'm using again is a Shooter's Choice product. It is their all-purpose all-weather grease. It's a great product, holds up in all kinds of weather. And you don't need a lot of it, just a little bit underneath that lug, and that's more than enough. A little bit goes a long way. So now at this point, I'm going to bring the two halves back together. I'm going to set them up. Now we're going to remount it. And once again, a lot of people are going to beat the muzzle with a mallet, and that method works well, but I'm not in favor of it. Again, real easy to damage something. So I'm going to grasp the upper receiver and grip frame like so, and I'm going to come here. And again, on a padded surface in corner of my workbench, I'm going to come down and give it one thump. The back of your upper receiver should overhang your pistol grip frame about a 32nd of an inch. All right, two more things and we're almost done. We're going to put the bolt back in, but we're going to do a slight modification to the recoil spring guide rod. I'll pause, see if the camera can catch up and catch this. This has a crimped together assembly. They take a piece of steel rod with a split, they slide on the spring, they drop in the horseshoe, and then they crimp the two halves together. And you get a rough edge there that acts as a detent. If we clean that up and grind a little concave in there, it'll make the assembly disassembly that much easier. Now you can use a round pillar file, you can even use a dowel with some sandpaper wrapped around it. I'm going to use my trusty Dremel tool with a 1/4 of an inch stone, and I'm going to come in, I'm going to give it a little bit of a concave, and then I'm going to bevel each side, top and bottom, and let's get that done. I'll pause and bring that up and see if the camera can catch it and show you how I've modified it. Okay, now we're going to put that back into the bolt. I'm going to lay the T in the front. I'm going to align the back section. What I'm going to do now, we're going to do the Ruger dance. We're going to start the reassembly. At this point, the hammer must be in a cocked position, lying down flat to allow the bolt back into the receiver tube. We put the bolt right back in. Now what we must do, the hammer must be uncocked, but the little strut must stay down parallel to the grip frame. So I'm going to look in the back, identify the hammer, pull the trigger, push the hammer forward, make sure my strut stayed backward. Alright, we're getting close to finishing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to replace the original solid bolt stop pin with the new two-piece design from Majestic arms. Use my bench block. This wants an 1/8 of an inch punch, and I'm going to drive out that pin. And it's been staked in also, so it might be tight. But I'm not going to drive it out all the way. This is a real simple little shortcut. I'm going to check myself and drive it out just far enough to release the original pin and not punch it all the way out of the assembly. It'll make it easier to go back. Take out our original pin, put it in the discard pile. I'm going to bring in my new bolt stop pin, and I'm going to use my little trick. Look down and knock the mainspring housing assembly down onto the pin. Now we'll duplicate the little stakes that you'll see on your pin. Little pin punch. Now we're ready to put that back into the gun and start doing a function check and enjoy the new features. So now we bring our bolt stop pin in. We snake it up through the receiver. It'll come out through the top. The strut now, and this is what's driven people crazy with Rugers for years, must find itself into this V-notch. At the bottom of that is a cup that sits on your mainspring, which is contained in this assembly. What I like to do is hold the gun upside down, identify the strut, and make it lean directly on the mainspring housing assembly, so that as I close this, I essentially envelop the strut. And when you're right, the last little bit will have a little spring tension. There we go, we're right. What I'm going to do now, nice trigger, but we're going to do a disconnector check. So we've dry fired it. We're going to maintain pressure on the trigger. Hold the trigger back, don't let go. rack the bolt, and now release the trigger, and it should set up for the next shot. Perfect function. I want to show you how short the stroke is on the trigger now. Trigger's motion prior to take-up is reduced now to about a 1/16 of an inch. Next safety check I'm going to do is I'm going to cock the gun, make sure the gun's cocked, lock my safety on, and I'm going to pull the trigger 10 times. When we turn off the safety, of course the gun should not have fired when I pulled the trigger, nor should it fire when I turn off the safety, and that functions just right. Let's check the dismantling. We have no magazine in place, the gun is not loaded. Do not dry fire the gun at this point. Take your Allen keys supplied with the kit, put it into the new bolt stop pin. They're going to be tight when they're new. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 revolutions. The relief cut on the pin, if you make it face the back, the pin comes out easier. If you don't, it still comes out, but it's easier if it faces the back. Pull it out, and now we can slip out our bolt for nice, quick, and easy cleaning. I put the bolt back into the receiver tube. Right now it's going to touch the hammer, and it's a camming action, the same way when you seat a pistol magazine. Slap it home. The last piece I'd like to point out to you is, and I'll pause, let the camera catch up to me. In the hole you'll see a little bit of the recoil spring guide protruding into the hole. The bolt stop pin is going to cam past that and go back into place. The way I do it is I put the Allen key on the pin, so now I have a big handle like a big house key. I like to hold the gun muzzle down, put the pin in, and just push and twist at the same time, and it'll go right back in. Several revolutions, hand tight. And that's the master kit. Let's check our new trigger pull. We use a Lyman digital scale. Gun is not loaded, the gun is cocked. Reset that. This one breaks at 1 pound, 15.8 ounces. That's great. Just under the 2 pounds in this particular gun. There's always some variations. That's our new speed strip kit, master grade. This is Dino from Majestic Arms. Thank you very much for watching the videos, and thank you for buying our products.